I got interested really in myth and legend, maybe when I was 3. One of my favorite bedtime stories is Beowulf, and that sort of started off, sparked my interest. Except my mother would fall asleep reading bedtime stories, so I would have to take the book and finish it after she'd fall asleep reading bedtime stories. So that sort of sparked my interest and led to the discovery of Arthur and Arthurian legend, probably when I was 5 or 6, and then I just read everything I could get my hands on. And so Arthur is sort of a little bit of a passionate topic for me. It's something that I've always had an interest in. I'm pretty well read on the subject. I'm not a scholar on the subject. That's not really what I do. But I've done extensive reading, and I'm very familiar with a lot of the works. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about really, I'm probably going to do an overview from Malory's work, because Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur was what sparked all of what's follows, and everything is based on it. And because everything else was just fragments and small pieces, bits and pieces, that Malory sort of combined together and collected into one large book and told the whole tale for the first time in one place. And so that kind of everything else up. That's sort of the overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to move around so she's going to have a hard time following with the camera. But we'll get started with.
You can walk about, I'll dance with it.
Okay. Does anybody have any pre-questions, anything you specifically want me to try to touch on during the talk? Yes?
The locations, specifically in the book, and how that, what sort of people, what sort of regions were they versus the people, such as Latin, locations and whatnot.
Okay, so Camelot was an introduction later. There probably was not a Camelot. The likelihood of where Arthur's court would have been held was Caerleon, which used to be a Roman fort, and so that would have been the likely seat of power for where Arthur, and we want to call it a seat of power. The likelihood is more that Arthur was just sort of an elected war leader than a king, although he may well have been a king of a very small geographical space. And Caerleon, like I said, was an old Roman fort. The interesting thing is that at Caerleon there's a large, round Roman amphitheater, and it's quite possible that that's the origin of the round table. This big round amphitheater, which would have been a great place to have war councils sit. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So I've got a lot of notes here. We're not going to be able to cover it all, but I'm going to talk about as much as I can. And I want this to be, as much audience participation as possible, because I personally don't like talking at people when I'm out in the audience. I don't like being talked at. So I'm going to start telling you about what I've got prepared, and then if we depart from that a little bit, then we'll go from there. And I'll tell you what I know, and what I don't know I'll make up, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so we talked about Arthur. He's probably, history is hugely divided. Historians cannot decide for sure, was there an Arthur or was there not an Arthur? Is it all imagining, or was there some real person that was the seed of all of the tales that follow? If there was an Arthur, he was a British leader in the late 5th, early 6th century, somewhere in there, so an Iron Age leader. And so he would have been pretty instrumental in fighting off the Saxon invasions. There are bits and pieces written in the 6th century. There's some Welsh writings. There is a poem called Y Grodin. I'm not going to make any pretenses about pronunciation. I'm going to do the best I can, but I can't tell you for sure. So this is attributed to the 6th century poet Aneurin, but it was really the only copy that exists is a 13th century. The earliest copy that exists is a 13th century copy. So it may have been written later, but it is said to have been written in the 6th century, which would have made it very close to Arthur's time. There's also a series of poems written by the poet Taliesin in the 6th century, also, and you might recognize the name Taliesin. Those were also have some references to an Arthur, but the first kind of historical text that mentions Arthur as a true figure was written in 830, and that was the Historia Brittonum that was written by the monk Nennius. So, this. What's that?
What was the name of the monk?
Nennius, Nennius. So he talks about, and the Historia Brittonum, really, or Brittonum, Historia Brittonum talks about 12 battles that Arthur fought in, including the Battle of Mount Badon, which is talked about pretty extensively. They say that Arthur, in the Historia Brittonum, it says that Arthur killed 960 men single-handedly in the Battle of Mount Badon. And I may even have an excerpt from this. Let me see if I have an excerpt from this. Here's the whole text that Nennius has written. Then it was that the magnanimous Arthur, with all the kings and military forces of Britain, fought against the Saxons. And though there were many more noble than himself, yet he was 12 times chosen their commander, and was as often conquered. The first battle in which he was engaged was at the mouth of the river Glenny. The second, third, fourth, and fifth were on another river by the Britons called Douglas in the region Lidui. The sixth on the river Basis. The seventh in the wood Celadon, which the Britons called Catquac Celadon. The eighth was near Gurnian Castle, which Arthur bore the image of the Holy Virgin, Mother of God, upon his shoulders, and through the power of our Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Mary, put the Saxons to flight and pursued them the whole day with great slaughter. The ninth was at the city of Legion, which is called Caerleon. The 10th was on the banks of the river Tode Frere. The 11th was on the mountain Breguan, which we call Cap Breguan. The 12th was a most severe contest when Arthur penetrated to the hill of Badon. In this engagement, 940 fell by his hand alone, no one but the Lord affording him assistance. In all these engagements, the Britons were successful. So those are the 12 stories, or the 12 battles that Nennius documents as having been fought by Arthur, if they can be considered historically accurate. So those were the early writings of Arthur, and if there's any kind of historical basis, those are the writings that any history would be gleaned from. Following that, things sort of become fantasized, sensationalized, and the legend grows into this broader Arthurian myth about the Court at Camelot, the Knights of the Round Table, the Pentecostal Oath, all of these things. And I'm sure that some of you have heard of these, some of you have not, and I will try and cover all of those things while we talk. So, in the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote Historia Regum Britanniae. And so this 12th century text had a lot of more chivalry and a romanticized approach to the stories of Arthur. Now, ultimately, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but first I'll go over kind of how the stories evolved. So in the 12th century, you have Historia Regum Britanniae. Then during this time, in 1155, a French poet, Maître Wace, adds the idea of the round table. And having these knights all sitting at a round table, so none of them can sit at the head of the table, and they're all equals, and Arthur's first among equals. So then you have Robert Bourne of Burgundy. It writes the first tale of the quest for the Holy Grail, which becomes very central to the concept of Arthur and his knights, where essentially in the storyline, Arthur and his knights have brought peace to the land. Everything is pretty calm, and they're getting bored. And so then they get this vision of the Holy Grail and this idea that they should go questing for it. So let's see, in 1200 AD, so we're talking about right at the turn of the 13th century, the priest Layamon translates the story into English. And it's the first time that the story of King Arthur is written in English, is in that 1200 text. And it is also the first time where the idea of the once and future king comes into play. The idea that Arthur didn't die of his wounds at the Battle of Camlan, but instead was taken beyond the mists of Avalon to sleep until he was needed again. And this idea of the once and future king really captured the imagination of all the readers, all the people that hold the tales, and probably would be what catapulted Arthur into everybody's imagination, across all the aficionados, all the people that read the stories, this idea that you have this man who was flawed, but always tried to live up to his ideals as best he could, and was able to unite Britain and create peace, and will someday return and reunite Britain and create peace. And then finally, we have Le Morte d'Arthur, which was written by Thomas Malory, and that was written in the 15th century, and that is pretty much the collection of all the tales of Arthur into one comprehensive, broad text that really is a brutally difficult read, but is what has created every myth, every story, every telling beyond that. Is based off of Malory's work, and so if you're willing to struggle through it, it's something I would call recommended reading. If you can find something that is translated more from Middle English into contemporary English, you'll probably have an easier read of it and still get the story in completion. So from the 15th century on, there was waxing and waning interest in the tales of Arthur. And then in the 19th century, Le Morte d'Arthur was reprinted for the first time since 1634. So you have a couple hundred years where there's really not a lot of new stories being put out or anything. But then in the 19th century, Le Morte d'Arthur is reprinted, and all of a sudden you create this whole 19th century gentleman's code of chivalry, which is all based off of this reprint of Malory's work. And then in 1832, Alfred Lord Tennyson starts writing his poetry about Arthur. So you see in the 19th century, everything starts to climb again. Sidney Lanier writes The Boy's King Arthur in 1880. Mark Twain writes A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court in 1889. And in the very tail end of the 19th century, Burne-Jones writes The Last Sleep of Arthur in Avalon. So as the 19th century, basically from the entire 19th century, the stories of King Arthur just absolutely infatuated Europe and the United States, and created this growth of the legend. So, and this lasts until roughly World War I. After World War I, all of a sudden chivalry kind of gets a bad name, and interest in Arthur wanes for a while until 1937. In 1937, all of a sudden out comes this comic strip in the newspapers, Prince Valiant. And all of a sudden, interest in Arthur begins to rise again. And this builds up to the 1958 book written by T.H. White, The Once and Future King, which is probably my second recommended reading, if you can read The Once and Future King. Very, very good telling of the tales in a slightly more readable form than Malory's work.
What was his dog name?
TH